Hello everyone, I am Jad Seki Arnoko and I am tasked to discuss the bibliographic work history, theory, and practice. So this article is, is from Chris Holden. So here is the abstract of this article. The bibliographic work has assumed a great deal of importance in modern cataloging, but the concept of the work has existed for over a century, and even some of the earliest cataloging codes differentiate between the intellectual work and its instances. This article will delve into the history and theory of the work, providing a basic overview of the concept as well as a summary of the myriad uses of the works throughout the history of cataloging. In addition to monographs, this paper will look at the work as applied to music, moving images, serials, and aggregates. So let's first define the bibliographic work. Bibliographic work is one of the cornerstones of cataloging. While modern cataloging codes are explicitly constructed around this entity, the idea of the work is implicit in cataloging documents dating back to the 19th century. So, this article today will present a basic definition of the work, explore how the idea of the work has contributed to the history of cataloging, and look at the work as used in current cataloging guidelines, and finally investigate how the work relates to a specific type of library resources. For what is a work? Okay, for a concept at the center of the bibliographic universe, the definition of a work can be surprisingly difficult to pin down. Richard Smiraglia wrote in 2001 that there is as yet no commonly accepted definition of a concept of a work. And since then, a series of new cataloging codes and bibliographic models have further muddied the waters. Rather than attempting to compare and contrast terminology, this article will expound upon Karen Cole's statement that the word has an imprecise but highly utile meaning, and examine elements that the disparate definitions of a work have in common. So, according to the theory of work, all creative activity has two components: the intellectual ideas and the carrier by which these ideas are communicated, such as printed text. The contents of the creator's ideas is what constitutes the work. On the other hand, the vessel for the communication of these ideas is known as the instance. While existing as separate entities, both the work and the instance rely on one another. The work is conceptual and intangible and can only find expression after being communicated through an instance. Let's have an example. Consider Victor Hugo's novel, This is Les Miserables. The work is the idea of the story that emerged from Hugo's mind. However, this work comes into existence through its instances, which are not necessarily identical. So I will give you some examples of instances. So based on the example Les Miserables, one such instance would be the original French version of the book in 1998 rather. A third instance is would be the English translation, while the fourth would be an audiobook of this English version of Les Miserables. Every time a new version of the novel is created, regardless of translation, medium, or edition, this is a new instance of the work. Whether it is translated through English, French, or Spanish, whether expressed in text or through an audio recording, all instances of Miserables represent the same ideas from Victor Hugo, and so represent the same work. So while the difference between the content of the work and the carrier of the instance is intuitive, catalogs have struggled to make the work searchable for patrons in a simple manner. Shoichi Taniguchi cites several earlier thinkers in his claim that almost all users are usually concerned with a text or a work, either example, intellectual or artistic aspect of an item, and not physical manifestation. However, despite this assertion, catalogs have been largely constructed to facilitate a search for individual instances. Most cataloging rules prioritize transcribing information from a title page or some similar source of information. This makes it easy to see if a library has a specific instance, but difficult to search for a work. Okay, here is another example. This patron is looking for a recording of Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro. This one. The Marriage of Figaro may not know to search for this work under its original Italian name, Le Nozze di Figaro. Works may be published under many different titles, especially if it's translated. And unless there is some way to collocate or bring together these instances, it will be impossible for one to search for all editions of a work held by the library. For this reason, catalogers have long stressed the importance of developing tools to search for works. As Richard Smiraglia writes, that no catalog that merely lists items can be considered useful. Rather, it is the intellectual content, that is, the works for which readers consult a catalog. To be useful, then, the catalog must clearly identify works in such a way that a user is assisted in making an informed selection. So there have been only a few small steps taken in this direction, and the obstacle remain large. Catalogs would have to be refashioned to adequately display works. Cataloging these works may take more time of the staff, and patrons may need to be trained to search for them. So let's proceed to the history of the work in cataloging codes. So cataloging rules began to be codified in the middle of the 19th century, and many of them, at least implicitly, acknowledge the distinction between the work and instance. So Anthony Panizzi, in compiling his landmark 1841 rules for compilation of the catalog, famously clashed with the trustees of the British Museum. While the trustees expected Panizzi to produce a mere list of books in the museum library, Panizzi insisted that the first and chief object of a catalog is to give an easy access to the works which form part of the collection. His rules called for all editions of a work to be collocated together, regardless of any title changes, and also allowed for translations of a work to be filed alongside the edition in the original language. Panizzi's focus on the importance of recognizing the intellectual content of the library's holdings, rather than simply the physical books, would set the stage for the next 175 years of cataloging theory. In his influential 1876 rules for a printed dictionary catalog, Charles Cutter also distinguished between the work and the instance. The rules begin with a list of objectives of the catalog, among them to assist in the choice of book as to its edition. Like Jewett's system, Cutter's rule would allow different editions of the same work to file together. In the era of the card catalog, the collocation of multiple instances of the same work was accomplished through the use of a uniform title, a standardized heading that allowed all editions of a work to be filed together, regardless of translations or a title change. The uniform title is similar to the title authorized access point used in present um, the American Library Association, 1908, catalog rules allowed for a work published under two or more titles to be filed under one, with cross reference to the other. So during this time period, uniform titles for works were not often used, in day-to-day cataloging, but special rules did call for their application when working with classical texts and musical publications. Examining the development of cataloging rules in 1936, Julia Pete theorized that a fundamental tenet of any cataloging code should be should be the identification of the literary unit, a similar concept to the word. The book in hand is considered not as a single item, but as a representative of a literary unit. It is the province of the catalog to assemble these literary units, issued in various forms, under a single caption. So, Petty hoped that concentrating on the collocation of the literary unit as an end goal would simplify cataloging rules, which, without change, threatened to transform into an encyclopedic work of pedantic distinction and specific directions for every possible vagary. So, in his 1953 Cataloging Rules and Principles, Lubetsky emphasized that catalogers should decide what the first principles of cataloging should be and build cataloging codes from those central tenets. Drawing from Cutter's earlier work, he listed two objectives for a catalog. First is to enable the user of the catalog to determine readily whether or not the library has the book he wants, and to reveal the user of the catalog what works the library has by a given author and what editions or translation of a given work. Lubetsky recommended the use of uniform titles to represent the work, while his cataloging rules would be the first set of rules to explicitly invoke the work as a foundational concept. He maintained that his objectives were the same as Panizzi's in 1849. So Lubitsky spent the next decade preaching the importance of the bibliographic work, as well as emphasizing the importance of tools that would enable users to search by word. A catalog of books and not works will often fail or mislead those relying on it. A 1960 summary of a conference presentation in Montreal on catalog code revision encapsulated his views. A book to be catalogued has two aspects. It is a bibliographical or physical entity, and at the same time, it is a vehicle by which intellectual content is presented. The fact that the medium of presentation may vary, while the intellectual content remains the same, presents the basic problem of cataloging. So the Paris Principle would be the theoretical foundation for the Anglo-American, I mean, the Paris Principles affirmed Lubetsky's second objective of the catalog, now articulated as the catalog should be an efficient instrument for ascertaining which works by a particular author and which editions of a particular work are in the library. Throughout the Paris Principles refer to the bibliographic work, including the recommendation of the uniform titles for collocating works known by various titles. The Paris Principles would be the theoretical foundation of the AACR, or known as Anglo-American Cataloging Rules. It is published in 1967, and the second edition of it is the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules 2, or the AACR 2. It's published with an ample modifications in 1978. Both of these editions of AACR contains instructions for the formulation of uniform titles to represent works. Okay, let's have the American Library Association that defined the work in its glossary as bibliographically defined a specific body of recorded information in the form of words, numerals, sounds, images, or any other symbols as distinct from the substance on which it is recorded. But despite its shortcomings with regards to works, AACR can be seen as a significant step forward. Here, the International Federation of Library Association and Institutions, or IFLA, published the functional requirements for bibliographic records, or also known as the FRBR, in 1998. As one of the most influential cataloging publications of the past 30 years, FRBR originated as a cataloging study grounded in entity relationship modeling. Rather than the traditional work instance model cited by past catalogers, FRBR called a four-tiered bibliographic model defining not only the work but also the expression, manifestation, and item. While the intricacies of FRBR are too complex to tackle in this article, it is important to note that FRBR explicitly defines the work as a distinct intellectual or artistic creation. It goes on to describe the work in far greater detail than any previous cataloging models. A work is an abstract entity. There is no single material object one can point to as the work. We recognize the work through individual realizations or expressions of the work, but the work itself exists only in the commonality of content between and among the various expressions of the work. Because the notion of a work is abstract, it is difficult to define precise boundaries for the entity. The concept of what constitutes a work and where the line of demarcation lies between one work and another may in fact be viewed differently from one culture to another. So let's have in 2005, development began on a new standard with a new name, Resource Description and Access, or the RDA. The first draft was released in 2010, and the RDA was widely adopted in 2013. RDA is generally aligned with the FRBR's four-tiered model, and instructions for recording work elements are given their own separate section. So apart from RDA, other cataloging documents also build on the FRBR model. For example, the Statement of International Cataloging Principles that first published on 2009 pulls its definition of the work from FRBR. So here, FRBR was also developed to appeal to other cultural heritage institutions. The desire to harmonize FRBR with models used by the museum community led to the creation of the FRBROO. It is an object-oriented conceptualization of FRBR that takes temporal entities and events into account. After initial versions published in 2009 and 2015, FRBROO was approved as an international standard in 2016. A detailed examination of FRBROO is beyond the scope of this paper, but its empirical analysis of entities and acknowledgement of temporality allows for a refinement of the concept of the work, introducing entities such as complex work, work conceptions, and container work. So developments taking place concerning the next generation of cataloging tools also involve the work. Okay. So let's have now the work and its application to different types of resources. Thus far, this article has a look at the concept of the work, chiefly as applied to textual monographs. This also mirrors the history of the work as represented in cataloging rules. So this involves the monographic books, serials, music, and um, also the moving image resources. So let's start with the monographic books. As outlined previously in this article, the theory of the work with regard to monographic books appears relatively simple. The work is considered the intellectual content, whereas the instance is how the content is manifested. Leo Tolstoy's Voyna i Mir, or in English War and Peace, exists as a work as Tolstoy's creative ideas and intellectual activity, and as an instance, as text printed on a physical page. This one is the Prison War, or known as Leo Tolstoy's Vojna I Mir. This work has been republished in many editions, often with supplementary materials such as introductions, illustrations, or critical notes, translated into many languages, adapted into television shows and films, and narrated for audiobooks. Some of these changes are minor tweaks, such as a new typesetting, while some are major undertakings. With each alteration, the cataloger is confronted with a question as to whether or not this change has led to a new work. Because the more we refine the work, the more the catalogers will ask the originality of the content. So the 1998 FRBR report introduced the expression entity to distinguish between variations of a single work. The report states that, with expression defined as an entity, we can describe the intellectual or artistic attributes of a particular realization of a work and use the differences in those attributes to signal differences in intellectual or artistic content. With this added level, one can now consider the Russian and English version of War and Peace to be two expressions of that work. Likewise, the printed monograph and spoken word audiobook versions of the novel would be the expressions of the same work. The 2017 LRM also defines expression with a heavy emphasis on textual monographs. It is an any change in form, example, from written notation to spoken word results in a new expression. Similarly, changes in the intellectual conventions or instruments that are employed to express a work. Example, translation of a textual work from one language to another. It results in the production of a new expression. If a text is revised or modified, the resulting expression is considered to be a new expression of the work. Let's go to the music. So, lacking what the 1998 FRBR report calls alphanumeric notation, music has been difficult to fit into the work or instant framework and the cataloging rules developed for text. Richard Smiraglia defines a musical work as a sonic intellectual conception and points out that music is meant to be experienced by an audience through the passage time. There is a conflict then between the bibliographic realm and where physical items exist on a static basis, and musical realm, where works exist momentarily in a time continuum. Okay, as an example is the Beethoven Seventh Symphony about this music. So the work itself exists as the sonic intellectual conception that sprang from Beethoven's mind. But the instances of that work can take myriad forms that quickly morph into a labyrinth of bibliographic relationship. Beethoven's central place in the musical canon makes his symphony an obvious candidate for a work with many instances, but studies shows that musical works in general tend to have a large number of bibliographic relationships. Okay, let's have the moving image resources. So, discussing moving images as works raises many of the same problems that apply to musical works, namely that there is an extra textual element that must be experienced temporally. Martha Yee has stressed that the essence of a moving image work is the picture or image, regardless of whatever dialogue or soundtrack might also be present. Many movies have textual scripts and musical soundtracks, but these have often been treated as separate but related works, and are not required for a moving image work to exist. As he writes, a moving image work is any work that is composed of visual images that move. However, the existence of elements such as scripts and soundtracks highlights an important aspect of moving images to work. They are ultimately a collaborative effort. Most Anglo-American cataloging codes have long recognized that films do not have a single creator, but rather a team of people who contribute different forms of creative activity, such as acting, directing, editing, and camera work. And because of this, films are not assigned in AACR terminology, author main entry. Many discussion of moving image work center around the distinctions of how much can be changed before a new work is created. So the same movie can exist in many instances, including films with scenes added or removed, films with different run times, specific regional versions, and so on. So, RDA defines a serial. Okay, we move now to the serial. So RDA defines a serial as a mode of issuance of a manifestation issued in successive parts, usually bearing number that has no predetermined conclusion. This can encompass journals such as Cataloging and Classification Quarterly, newspapers like the New York Times, magazines like Sports Illustrated, and even annual reports issued by an organization. And because serials have no single author or creator, many of the standard definitions of a work don't quite fit, and as a result, the serial has been ignored in discussions on the work. There is even some debate as to whether a serial can be considered a work at all, although most catalogers consider them to be so, albeit with some caveats. Stephen Shuttle writes, most serialists would agree with the concept that a serial is an intellectual work. A journal is more than just a collection of articles. Editorial controls, shapes the scope and content, and peer-reviewed often revises the draft content or keeps content from appearing. Thus, the serial can be considered an intellectual construct of shared responsibility. Okay, next in line is the aggregate. Cataloging theories have been aware of aggregates as far back as the 19th century, but they have received real attention from the cataloging community only recently. Rules regarding the cataloging of aggregates have been scant, and throughout most of the history of cataloging, there has not been a single accepted method to deal with them. Even the use of the term aggregate in cataloging is relatively new, and so definitive definitions are lacking. Mahazumer defines the aggregate as any instances of a bibliographic entity created by combining bibliographic units together to form a whole. But an aggregate is not simply a book divided into chapters or a novel issued into volumes. The combined bibliographic pieces are units that can also stand alone as complete works. While a chapter removed from a novel forms part of a larger work, an aggregate is made up of several works that can also function as complete works outside their presence in the aggregate. So the IFLA working group on aggregates um, states that the process of aggregating itself is an intellectual or artistic effort and therefore meets the criteria for work. These are the three different types of aggregates. First is the aggregate collection of expressions. Okay, so here, this aggregate compiles expressions in different works, such as the CD that compiles multiple songs or a volume that contains multiple short stories. Next is aggregate resulting from augmentation is a single work. This supplemented with at least one other dependent work, such as a novel that is prefaced with an introduction by the editor. An And third is an aggregate of parallel expressions. It arises when a single work is published in multiple languages, such as a poem in Latin, published side by side with its English translation. The modeling of aggregate works is a complex and ongoing topic, and there is still uncertainty as to how this will play out in actual cataloging practice. It just delve to more detail requires a strong background in the LRM. So the last part of the discussion today is the conclusion. So while the work has existed as an important aspect of cataloging since the first codified rules of the profession in the 19th century, the digital revolution has allowed the concept to come to the forefront of cataloging theory in a way that it never could in the past. The work has a robust history spanning nearly 150 years of cataloging rules, guidelines, and theories, and the future of a work may further alter the field in profound ways. So next is the LRM explicitly states that its definition were as strict as possible to make use with linked open data applications easier and allow for reuse of data in semantic web applications. The work of the 21st century will be a digital entity that can be linked and reused by any number of linked data systems. And lastly, to predict the future of information organization would be foolish, but one can assume that the work will continue to play a role of a great importance in the future cataloging endeavors. So it is really important for us to differentiate um, the work and the work as well as the instances in every collections that we have in the library. So that would be all for my discussion for today. Thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, you can find me at my Gmail account. So thank you and God bless.